This week it's soil hydrology. Why are we studying this? Well, we need to understand how water moves through the soil to get to the groundwater system. In my hands I have a soil moisture probe, 3 very dangerous looking spikes there, and current is measured between these to understand how much soil moisture is in the soil, and we use that to understand soil hydrological characteristics. And that's what you can see in the picture on this slide. So it's useful for research. This is a research instrument, but it's also very useful in the home garden. This is at home in my vegetable patch, to measure soil moisture to stop your plants from dying. So the skills you'll learn this week are also relevant for agriculture and irrigation, keeping your pot plants alive, and understanding hydrology in the earth system. Let's start by considering the question, what is soil hydrology? And soil hydrology is the study of water movement through the soil. An example is shown on the right-hand side. Water generally enters the soil by infiltration, that's after rainfall, and the soil can hold water by surface tension around the solid particles and also in the voids between those solid particles in the soil. And the amount of water that the soil can actually hold depends on the properties of the soil, things like the number of pore spaces and how accessible they are. And there's a limit to how much water can be stored in the soil. At the highest amount, water saturation, the soil can hold no more water. If you let that water drain freely from the soil, it reaches another threshold which is called the field capacity, and that's when no more water can drain from it. It's being held there by surface tension. As a soil gets wetter and wetter, as it reaches field capacity, then the water might start to move through the pores, downwards, and groundwater recharge might occur. As you wet the soil up even further and you reach the saturation level, and no more water can be held anywhere in the soil, then you might start to get surface runoff. Understanding soil hydrology is important to understand the hydrological cycle and to enable us to have sustainable soil water management for agriculture, as well as for things like your pot plant at home. But for agriculture and irrigation, it is so important that the Bureau of Meteorology runs this Australian water landscape model. That's the example shown on the right-hand side. And you can see all the components of the model that are needed to understand soil hydrology. You need to understand the precipitation coming in, the loss by evapotranspiration. In this model, water is moved between an upper, a lower, and a deep soil moisture term. When field capacity is reached and you might get water movement through the macropores, then you might get this deep drainage term down to the groundwater. And when saturation occurs, you might get water ponding on the surface, and you might start to get overland flow or runoff, which is this term here. So that's why understanding soil hydrology is of fundamental importance. If you need to understand how to manage plant growth, that could be a crop, but it could also be a pot plant in your house or apartment. In agriculture, an understanding of soil hydrology permits water efficient irrigation. You don't want to over-irrigate and waste our water resource. For native vegetation, if we understand soil hydrology, it improves our understanding of how that vegetation might respond to things such as climate change. The example on the right-hand side shows the different states of soil moisture, shown here on the lower half of the figure, compared to the state of the plant. In this case, it looks like it's a tulip in a plant pot. So we start with the water being saturated. It's actually sitting in water, and as you allow that to drain, you come to a point where no more water leaves, and that's the field capacity. Water will still leave the soil though through evaporation and transpiration, which means that there is increasingly less available water to the plant until the plant reaches the wilting point and starts to die. And if water isn't made available to the plant at that point, it might reach this point here, which is the permanent wilting point, which means the plant has been too stressed and your crop or your plant will fail or die. And that's explained in words in the second part of this slide. So if there's too little water in the soil for the plant roots to extract, then the wilting point for that plant is reached. Without the addition of water from rainfall or irrigation, the plant or crop will die. And an ideal soil for plant growth is one that is porous enough for water to infiltrate, because you need to get the water in, but not so porous that the water drains so freely that the water leaves too quickly. And that means it would probably have a range of pore sizes, as well as soil organic matter, which helps improve the soil texture, which then helps it retain water. More of that in the lab class. Why else is soil hydrology important? Well, we need soil hydrologists. We need people who can understand and quantify soil hydrology so that we can include that in models of the whole hydrological cycle. And that's important because we need these models to be able to predict and forecast the height of floods. In 2022, Australia was hit by many large floods, continuing in 2023 in Western Australia. And in many cases, there were flood forecast models. And if you followed the news, you would often hear the forecast for the water level for that day. And these models are based on data sets that include needing to understand the soil hydrological properties. And these models are fed by the rainfall and the rainfall amount, and they have to predict the runoff and how quickly the runoff reaches the rivers. And they have to get that correct to be able to forecast a flood peak. We also need to understand soil hydrology, and we need to have soil hydrologists because we need to include the hydrological cycle in our models of global climate and global climate change. And in particular, if we need to understand how the water balance will change with climate change and rainfall will vary with climate change, then we need to have very accurate and precise parts of the model called land surface models, which is shown on the right-hand side here. They have to be included within our global climate models. And the figure on the right is taken from a review paper, a perspectives paper by Fisher and Coven in 2020. And it starts in the 1970s and goes through to the end of the 2010s. And it shows all the different parts of land surface modeling and how it evolved over time. So 50 years ago, land surface models only considered energy. Soil moisture came in the 1980s and continues to the current day. Lakes, rivers, and wetlands only became part of these land surface models around about the turn of the millennium. And then groundwater, land use change, cropping, lateral flow across the landscape has only come in the last decade. So you can see here that understanding soil moisture, soil hydrology, and how that fits into the water cycle is fundamentally important if we're going to be able to model it in terms of climate models and climate change. Thirdly, we need to understand soil hydrology and soil hydrological processes if we're to know when and where groundwater recharge occurs. And we have a relatively poor understanding of when, where, and the process by which groundwater is being recharged today. And that's because it's an invisible resource and it's very hard to actually monitor the processes that are happening beneath our feet in the subsurface. More on this in more detail next week. But to give you a taster here, the reason why we don't understand the amount of water reaching our groundwater very well is that we're normally reliant on data sets from boreholes or wells. And these bores or wells sample water which integrates over a large area. And we can only get a very approximate estimate of where that recharge may have come from and how much it was. And these bores, they can't tell you whether the recharge has come through the soil, as an example on the right-hand side, or whether it's come from leaking rivers or lakes where water is actually leaving the base of these features and recharging the groundwater that way. You'll see some examples of this all in the field next week. For now, it's important to know that this knowledge gap means that we are not able to manage our groundwater resource sustainably. And one of the fundamentals that we need to understand then is the soil hydrological cycle as shown in the right-hand side. We need to be able to measure and model all of these words on the right-hand side. The amount of rainfall coming in, the amount of evaporation leaving, the amount of transpiration from the trees, the soil hydrology, so we can work out when there's going to be runoff occurring, when there's going to be groundwater recharge, and how much recharge there will be. what is happening in class this week and what do you need to do to be prepared for the class test. Firstly, I shall say that this class may vary from year to year, depending on the weather outside and the availability of the labs and the class size. So please listen for announcements. But most likely, we'll be asking you to go into the field at home and bring some samples to analyze in the lab. So we're bringing the field to the lab. And the most likely experiment we'll ask you to run is to bring some soil samples to the lab, and we'll ask you to work out the field capacity and the soil water saturation and investigate how that relates to soil properties such as soil texture. Whatever we do, the aim of this class is to introduce you to soil moisture measurements, an example of a soil moisture probe there on the right hand side, and how they can be used in field and laboratory experiments to determine soil hydrological properties. And your learning outcomes will include how to measure soil moisture content and how to experimentally determine soil saturation values and measure some basic soil properties. And before the class, I'd like you to review the content of this presentation and also read this article on soil water dynamics, which is published in the Nature Education Knowledge series. The hyperlink is here. And all of this article is relevant to the field class, and the things that I'd like you to understand, I'll present on the final slide. We'd also like you to analyze a soil sample from your home, or if you don't have access to soil in the place where you're living at the moment, if you can, then also you can ask a family member or a friend, someone that does have a garden. If you can do so, please collect a soil sample in a Ziploc plastic bag, just like the picture on the right hand side. You will need enough soil for the soil moisture probe to be completely immersed in the soil, and a sandwich bag size of soil is ideal. When collecting the sample, please use a trowel to scrape away any surface leaves. Try and remove any obvious roots and non-soil material if present. Wear gloves if you have them, and definitely wash your hands afterwards. Please only collect a soil sample with the permission of the landowner. And label the bag with your name and the postcode where it is collected. And if for any reason you can't collect a soil sample, please don't worry, you can still come to the class. You'll just be analysing someone else's sample. It's much more fun if you are able to collect a soil sample for somewhere that you have some interest in. What do you need to understand before coming to the class? These are the things that you're likely to be asked about in the class test, which will again be a simple format, multi-choice style or short answer test. You should understand the definitions used in soil hydrology. That's the words in bold in the required reading. So definitions such as field capacity, saturation, evapotranspiration, percolation, macropore. You should understand the processes of how soils gain and lose water, and understand why runoff, which is also known as overland flow, occurs. And you should understand how water movement through the soil can lead to groundwater recharge. If you read that one piece of required reading and recap the material in the slides, you should be fine for the class test. And I look forward to seeing you in class, where we'll be making a big mess with lots of water and lots of soil. So please wear appropriate clothes, things that you don't mind getting a little bit dirty and muddy. See you in class.